Objectives. One thing they aren't is they're not just a list of topics that you're covering in your course. Okay, they're more in depth than that. A learning objective should describe what students should know or be able to do at the end of the course or the lesson that they couldn't do before. I think it's probably pretty much how we all understand objectives anyway. It's something they should be able to do or know when we're finished teaching them. The learning objectives should always be about student performance. We're talking about two types of learning objectives here. Formal learning objectives are behavioral in nature. They're going to do something. Exactly. It's an active process. 90% of learning objectives are formal learning objectives. The other 10% are informal learning objectives. And they are more process oriented. Okay? How they're going to get there. So remember, formal makes up about 90%, behavioral, informal 10%, process oriented. Okay, we're going to talk here about the ABCDs. Okay, we'll talk about the ABCD format. This is the most common protocol used in instructional design for writing what are called terminal and enabling objectives. We're going to differentiate those two a little later, but so you understand those terms. Okay? So let's talk about A. A stands for audience. The audience is the end user. Boy. The audience is the end user in your design process. The student, okay? Pupil, who you're designing this for. You need to be as specific as possible when you are writing audience statements for your objectives. Now you can say, they should. It's the students will, not they will. Who's there? So be specific. A well-written audience element helps give a picture of the participants based in reality. Again, if we say they, it's hard to picture they. You could be they. A whole other group could be they. Okay? But say the students, okay, it's a particular group. You can visualize those. All right, B stands for behavior. Okay? The behavior is a valid description of an anticipated outcome. In other words, what you want the audience to do. So the behavior is what it is they're going to do. Behavior should be worded in a format such as will, should, must, or be required. But you need to be careful about which format is chosen. And by the way, most of this information that I'm presenting right now is found in chapter 9 in the book, which we're not reading. So this is kind of your chapter 9 overview. But if you want to go back and look at some of this more in depth, you will find it in chapter 9. All right, also with behavior. Must not use verbs such as learn and understand. Why? Because there's no way to measure or observe. Okay? See, I can tell Danae's understanding this, right? Because, well, I don't know how. Okay? Because of the smile on her face. Measurable, object, no. Okay? It's observable, okay? But not really measurable. Unless I want to measure her smile. It's about a 3-inch smile. Okay. Verbs such as create, list, construct, and repair are observable and measurable. And in your book in table 9.1, there is a table of these verbs you can use. C stands for conditions. So conditions provides two design elements. Number one, it provides the context for the learning environment and the framework for evaluation for each learning event. So kind of where it's going to take place and how we're going to know. Condition statements generally begin with the word given, followed by the elements that relate to the objective. So here's an example. Given classroom discussion, handouts, and a short presentation, and then you go on with the rest of the task. Conditions may include tangible things like tools, books, equipment, hardware. So it should be given the information you've read in chapter 4, this will be your task. It may appear at times that condition statements are either too obvious to be useful or overly complicated. So you got to watch for that. Seems like it's too much or too little, and you may need to adjust it. Also, subtle differences in context can sink an otherwise great course. All right, let's go to D. So D is degree. That's the accomplishment. What they accomplish. What is mastery going to be? It's the evaluative finishing line of mastery. So the behavior element says jump, for example. The degree element says how high indicates mastery. Okay, we mentioned briefly beforehand terminal and enabling objectives. So we want to differentiate those two now. A terminal objective defines a terminal or exit competency that is expected of a learner at the end of a course, module, program, lesson, whatever. So here's an example. Given a functioning two-wheeled bike, the learning to bike basics student should be able to ride a bike for 100 feet or more without assistance. Okay. So again, that's the exit competency. It's what they should be able to do at the end of that lesson or that course or whatever. Okay. So that is a terminal objective. Enabling objectives enable a terminal objective by providing a detailed set of objectives that break down a terminal objective to its most basic learning elements. So that might be almost like the steps of building a peanut butter sandwich. Enabling objectives are always sequenced to allow for a gradual building of skills from simple to complex. So here's an example of an enabling objective. Given a functioning two-wheeled bike with training wheels, the learning to bike basic student should be able to adjust the handlebars to the correct height in 2 attempts. All right, so do's when you're writing these objectives. Okay? Your behavioral objectives should always be written in the ABCD format. You should frame the objectives from the perspective of the end user of the training, not the facilitator. Now, I would like to see such the student will. And this part can get a little bit, kind of combine do and don't here a little bit, but always written for the individual learner. Even though you've got a group of students, most likely in most cases, you write the objective as if it's to an individual learner, even though it applies to all learners. You should have an objective, and it is necessary for each learning activity. And it's key that if an activity is important enough to be included in a design plan, then it's important enough to have a written objective. So if you're going to include it in your design plan, there should be an objective written for that. Don't write too many or too few objectives. How do you judge that? Well, if the objective stands on its own, then it probably fits. If it doesn't, if it depends too heavily on something that you're not covering, then that's probably not a good objective and should be left out. Remember that objectives are not goals. Goals are general statements of desired outcomes. Objectives are detailed statements of outcomes. Okay? This is what the student should be able to do at this level. Okay? Talked about not promising anything you have no control over. That can be anything from almost attitudes. So if you're basing things on attitudes, sometimes or that, if you're basing an objective on that, you don't have any control over that. Okay? So it shouldn't be using an objective. And remember, the objective should be measurable and observable.